All right, everyone, thank you all for pulling up. This is week 9. We're going to be going over how JavaScript meets HTML and CSS, as well as dark design today. So some announcements for the course. Sorry. Go. So homework 7 is due today, and then homework 8 will be released later tonight. That will be on JavaScript. We'll be doing some review as well, because I know it's been a bit from break. And then lab 6 was released on Monday. It'll be due next Monday as per usual. As for the final project, we've had some questions about when that will be released. Also will be released soon. We're hoping for next week. It's essentially a little more open-ended, so don't feel too worried. And as for grade reports, if you haven't received it yet, they'll be out by tomorrow. Sorry about the delay, I've been a little behind on that. And if you guys are curious, we have some past projects from long previous semesters from Warada, and you can find out on our showcase website. Slides will be in our Notion as always. But now I'll pass it off to Stekpal to teach about JavaScript today. Just use this.
Hello guys, I'm back. So we'll start with a review of the variables and functions that we have learned so far. So begin off with the basics of like JavaScript. If you want to have variables, you have to use like the let command, and after that, name the variable, and then make it equal to some sort of number or string. If you're using strings, use quotation marks around your words or numbers. And if you're just using an integer, then you just leave out the quotation marks and just use the integer itself. So pretty basic when using variables. If you want to make changes to variables, we learned that you have to make sure that you put an equal sign, right? To make sure that the change is satisfied and remembered for future calculations. If you just use, if you make like a change and it's not with an equal sign, there'll be an error pop up because JavaScript doesn't recognize that as like a memorable change. And finally, we'll learn about using functions. As you can see, the syntax of creating a function and then using it later. To use the function, you have to just call the function and whatever input is required. Sometimes the input isn't even required. And yeah, just basic stuff that helps you get started with JavaScript. And just combining everything together, if you want to use like a function that squares a number, make it return just the multiplication of that number by itself. And that will just be used later on and be remembered in a variable, like let y equals square 5. That's remembered in the y variable, and then you can use it later on in the z variable and square that number again. So just make sure you have those equal signs in, make sure you know what variable you're using so you can move on properly. Now it's up to the new concepts, objects. Right, so objects are basically what helps us make sure that we can interact with the page better. It allows us to do complex tasks, so we can work with different functionalities of the page, such as color, size, etc. And the two main things you have to keep in mind with objects is that there's the properties and the functions. The properties of an object is basically things that are consistent most of the time. So like color of a car, model of a car, that doesn't change with the car itself. And a function is something that allows us to change those variables. So if you want to change the color of a car, you have a function that says change color of the car. If you want to change the model of a car, you have a function that says change model of a car, and it does that action. So properties are usually like pretty consistent and stay the same, while functions allow us to make those changes and make those different concepts occur. Again, just to like clearly distinguish between them, as you can see on the left side, there's the properties, the color, model, and miles per hour, which is the properties that stay consistent. And then we can mess with those properties and change them to our desire using these functions that we can create. So these are the main two concepts of an object that you should keep in mind when designing for future websites. Now let's walk through how this object might look like. Again, we use the let command. It basically allows us to create the object. So car is the object in this expression, as you can see in the syntax. So at the top, we have the properties that stay consistent. So color, model, and miles per hour, as we saw before. Two of them are strings and one of them is an integer. At the bottom, we see the functions. So we have the drive straight function, the break function, and the change color function. That's like the syntax of creating the functions. It's pretty similar, but just remember that these objects are all surrounded in the curly brackets. So as you can see from the start of the, let's see what's over there. So as you can see from like the start of the object itself, there's a curly bracket that starts the object, and at the bottom, the last curly bracket is what ends the object, and within it is all the properties and functions. So keep in mind to like place those curly brackets so you can know where your object is and that it actually works properly. So you don't have to worry about this much in this class, but this is basically syntax so you can remember how to work with objects and see how they're created. In addition, if you want to access the different properties and functions, you have to use the dot command. So for example, if you want to see, if you want to use the drive straight command for this object, which is car, use car.driveStraight, and that calls the function of that object. And if you want to change the color of it, you can use the same thing. And then to see the specific properties, you have to use a function called console log, and it's like similar to if you guys use Python, like print, it kind of does the same thing, but it just shows you the color of the car. So if you have console.log and then car.color, it'll just show you the properties of the car. Good so far? Any questions? Cool. All right. So now let's get back to how JavaScript meets HTML and how we can use that to create more interactive and creative websites. So on the left side, we can see the familiar index.html, how HTML pages look like. And then on the right side, we can see something new, which is how JavaScript reads that HTML page and how we can see the hierarchies of how you can work with these functions. So a lot of information here, but the main thing you have to recognize is there's like the HTML page is split up into different sort of objects. So as you can see, the document itself is split up into is object itself, and it's split up into a function and properties. So the document's properties are title, and its functions are get element by ID and get element by class name. And we'll talk about this after. But just to read how JavaScript actually interprets the website, you see that it's split up into different objects, and you can work with these objects to create interactable websites. Now, focusing on the document.getElementById, which is a function of the HTML page itself. So this function will encompass the whole page, which is the document. So what does this function actually do? So when you want to get work with a specific HTML element, you usually assign it an ID, right? So if you want to work with that element, use this function, document.getElementById, and input the ID name so you can configure it however you want to. Again, here's an example for food list. So this was one of the objects you saw in the previous two slides. Here, the ID of the food list is basically food list. And this way we can make sure that the variable gets that, basically that function, gets that element and then stores it into that list element variable so we can work with it in the future. So the main thing to remember about this is if you want to work with specific HTML elements, make sure that you have an ID name assigned to it. So that way you can use the get element by ID. And then there's also a function we previously mentioned back here, get element by class name. So you can also use that to do a similar thing if a class name is what you prefer to use. But yeah, that's the basics of that. Now let's walk through this. Right, so here we can see an example of the properties of like get element by ID. And again, we use the console.log function here to basically show what we're actually doing. So we have document.getElementById food list, and we're using console.log to print what food list actually has. So foodlist.classList is a function that shows you basically what's within the food list itself. So it shows you the blue box. Doesn't matter much, but as you can see at the bottom, the HTML correlates to the food list ID. So you can see like you basically pull that HTML element into that variable. So again, why are we doing this? Why do we need to know about get element.id, right? It seems just a bit confusing. But the main thing we want to do is we want to be able to work with these HTML elements so we can like make sure that if a user clicks on them, interacts with them, hovers over them, that we can change their size, change their color, and do very like cool animations and stuff like that in the future. And it just makes the website more interactable. It allows us to work with more complex ways to work with different websites. So it's just another layer to the CSS you guys have already been learning. Again, here's another example is document.getElement by ID. It allows us to use the dark mode button. It's just an HTML element, and it acts as the button we click on. And then in the future slides, we'll see how we can, what action occurs if you click on that button. So another method that we recommend using throughout homeworks and labs and final project is document.query selector. And the query selector is basically the same thing as like ID, but it doesn't go to a specific ID. If you have like multiple IDs, it always picks up the first ID that comes by. So let's skip this. So for example, if you want the child class, it only picks the first child class, even if you have the first one. So the main thing with this function is that if you have multiple different class names, multiple different ID names, you can use this to grab the first occurrence of that element, and just allows you to work with it easier. And if you just have only one, it'll just go with it'll interact as the same way as the get.id function, and just act similar to that. So the main thing with this theme is just if you have multiple elements, it just allows you to work with it easier. Now we can actually go on to how CSS is correlated with JavaScript, how you can make those interactions like actually change the website to your liking. So far, any questions? Confusing? Understandable? You good? All right. Now, adding, removing CSS classes with JavaScript. So as I mentioned before, the class list is basically, it correlates to like the CSS elements that are in it. So we're just gonna walk through how the document.getElement by ID works and how you can use that to add and remove CSS elements. So here we have the first part of our object, which is the document, and we use its function .getElement by ID. I've been saying it over and over again. It's kind of hard, but yeah, we use that function, and that allows us to get to the properties of the food list, because that's the ID we're looking for as we input it into the function itself. And when we do .ClassList, we can see that we see all these other functions within the object. So class list itself is also an object. So here we can add, remove, or toggle between different CSS elements, as you can see with the functions and how there are like those three functions that you can work with. So to get to that point, this is a good slide to like keep in mind. You go .getElement by ID from the document, and then you input the ID that you want to get. And from there, you do .ClassList, so you can add or remove or toggle between different CSS elements, like size or color, things like that you'll work with in your future labs. Right, so changing CSS elements. So this slide is gonna sort of walk you through the same thing. As you can see, the variable is correlated with the .getElement by ID. So when we do that function, it puts in, it just acts as like a holder, a pointer to the function itself. And then on the first part, we can see that when we console.log this, result only has a blue box in it. But as you can see on the second highlighted piece, we add a dark mode to this class list. And we can see on the second console.log that the class list is added to the result. So just keep that in mind. When we add these things, it goes back, it gets added to the class list. And if you use it wisely, you can change the CSS element of it. That's for a future lecture, but just know you can access the class list this way. Again, another walkthrough of how we get to that point. Again, we use that dot get element by ID. We find the ID, and then we go from the class list, and then we use one of the functions of the class list to add or remove or toggle between the different forms you want to put in. There we go. And removing a class works the same way. Rather than using .add, you use .remove. So here we have the original one we added to. We added the dark mode to it. And we can do the same thing and just use the remove function to remove that dark mode and basically only have the original list left. Now, this will be covered in the next lecture, but I want you guys to think how we can use this functionality to add, remove CSS elements. If you have two CSS elements in that list, will they work out? How will you need to remove a CSS element and add a new one in? What does the toggle feature do? This is stuff to think about for the future lectures. But the main things I want you guys to get out of this lecture is that the document itself is like an object, and you can access its different properties of functions, and then you can add and remove different functions and properties as you go deeper into the document. So yeah, that's usually the end of this lecture. Any questions? Understandable? This is your last chance, or no questions ever. All right, cool. Thank you.